The airport echoed with the sounds of people. The crowd moved back and forth inside the terminal. Announcements played one after another. People rushed around, some excited, others waiting anxiously. Samuel clutched his old but clean suitcase tightly and took a deep breath. Deep breathing always helped him stay calm. Even though he had become accustomed to silence, he felt even more alone in crowded places like this. Not being able to speak, not being able to express himself, had made him strong over the years. But people's lack of understanding sometimes shook that strength. As he passed through security, he noticed a female officer giving him a strange look. He was used to it. When people saw someone different like him, they either looked at him with pity or discomfort. Samuel ignored it, quickened his steps, and continued toward the boarding gate. Through the airport windows, he saw the massive airplane waiting on the runway. A wave of excitement spread through him. Flying always gave him a strange feeling. It was as if ascending into the sky meant escaping the world for a little while. Maybe this brief escape was a momentary relief from the hardships of life. The boarding announcement was made. Samuel gripped his ticket tightly and got in line. The passengers ahead of him presented their tickets one by one and moved forward. When it was his turn, he handed his ticket to the attendant. The attendant glanced at the ticket quickly and then shot Samuel a peculiar look. He didn't know what to think, but he was used to it. Without reacting, he nodded slightly and moved forward. As he entered the plane, he hesitated for a moment in the aisle. Everyone was settling in, placing their cabin baggage, adjusting their seats. Samuel took out his ticket again to check his seat number, but he couldn't find it right away. Using sign language, he approached the nearest flight attendant to ask for help. The woman first looked at him without understanding. Samuel tried again to explain with hand gestures, but her face suddenly hardened. She frowned and, in a stern voice, as if he had done something wrong, asked, "Can you speak?" Samuel shook his head no. The woman sighed audibly, rolled her eyes, and glanced at his seat number. Then, with a dismissive wave of her hand, she said coldly, "Somewhere ahead. Find it yourself." Samuel hesitated for a moment. A small ache formed in his heart. He had encountered this kind of behavior countless times, yet it still hurt the same way every time. 1,000 words gathered inside him, but he couldn't say a single one. He simply lowered his head slightly and walked down the aisle without making eye contact with anyone. Some of the passengers had witnessed the incident. Some ignored it and continued looking ahead, while others stared at Samuel with unsettling curiosity. One of them chuckled quietly. Samuel pretended not to hear, but the sound echoed in his mind. He finally found his seat and sat down silently. Resting his head against the window, he took a deep breath. The plane had been gliding through the sky for several hours, and time was passing slowly. While the endless blue of the sky stretched outside, the passengers inside had settled into a shared silence. A few had their headphones on. Some were watching movies on their screens. Most had eventually dozed off. As always, Samuel gazed out of the window, lost in deep thoughts. Every time he boarded a plane, he felt as if he were simply moving from one place to another in this vast world. However, despite this comforting feeling, there was an emptiness inside him. That void was filled with the sorrow of enduring people's harsh behaviors, an ache that even the serenity of flying could not ease. Suddenly, an announcement echoed from the cockpit, informing the passengers that meal service would begin. Samuel noticed the preparations as the flight attendants moved through the aisle. Only a few hours had passed, but the pangs of hunger had begun to unsettle his body. Slowly, he straightened up and glanced around. Other passengers were receiving their meals, chatting cheerfully with the attendants who served them with warm smiles. Some were selecting their meals from the menu, while others were engaged in lively conversations. Samuel turned his head and watched as the flight attendants pushed the meal cart forward. Now it was his turn, but as always, he would have to rely on hand gestures to communicate, a challenge he faced all too often. Meal service was always another hurdle for Samuel. People assumed he could order normally until they realized he was mute. The moment his difference became apparent, their attitudes changed. Expressing himself had always been a struggle, and relying on the understanding of others often left him exhausted. Why should something as simple as receiving a hot meal be so difficult? At last, the meal cart reached him. After serving the passengers before him, the flight attendant turned to Samuel. He raised his hand politely, attempting to sign "meal, please" in sign language. The attendant stared at him for a moment, her expression darkening. She had encountered such requests before, and her face showed no patience for them. Samuel, remaining calm, repeated his gesture, but the flight attendant's eyes were filled with visible discomfort. She furrowed her brows and asked in an impatient tone, "What do you want?" Her voice didn't carry genuine curiosity. It was cold, as if she were reprimanding him rather than assisting. Samuel signed "meal" again with his fingers. The attendant pursed her lips, reached for a tray, and placed it in front of him. However, the meal before him was unlike what the other passengers had received. While others were given a choice between chicken and pasta, he was handed a low-quality plate of pasta, hastily put together without care. The meal lacked the usual accompaniments. There was no drink, no side dish, only a few slices of dry bread. It was clear that no effort had been made to ensure his satisfaction as a passenger. A sharp pain stirred in Samuel's chest as he registered the unfairness of the situation. After handing him the meal, the flight attendant quickly turned away, focusing on other passengers. Her avoidance was all too familiar to Samuel. His silence, in the eyes of others, was often mistaken for weakness or incompetence. Over time, he had learned to recognize these reactions. Each time they left small yet deep wounds. In that moment, he thought to himself that nothing would change. After all these years, perhaps hoping for anything different was meaningless. A short while later, the man sitting next to Samuel turned his attention to him. He glanced at Samuel's tray, remaining silent for a moment. Then, without a word, he picked up his water bottle and handed it to Samuel. His eyes carried a quiet understanding, free of pity or mockery. Samuel hesitated. People had always looked at him differently, either with pity or disdain, but this man's gaze held neither. There was only a simple act of kindness. The man slightly bowed his head and offered a gentle smile. Samuel, grateful, nodded in return and took the bottle silently. The man smiled again but said nothing, turning back to his own meal. Samuel ate slowly. Each bite seemed to carry the weight of his experiences, the heaviness of his reality. The taste of the pasta was indifferent, but the bitterness inside him grew stronger. The journey was long, yet the ache within him had little to do with the flight itself. It was a reflection of his life. Every moment, every journey, every encounter with people wore him down a little more. No matter how much he tried to communicate, he often went unheard. Though he lived in silence, his emotions spoke louder than words. But instead of words, he relied on looks, gestures, and most of all, his heart. This meal service was just the surface. Samuel's true struggle lay in the way people treated him daily. After the heavy and unjust treatment during the meal service, Samuel felt slightly more at ease. As he finished his meal and placed the tray back on the table, he continued to watch the commotion surrounding the meal service. The unease within him wasn't just about physical hunger. His thoughts tangled together, the tension still lingering inside. But perhaps, even if just for a short while, he needed to forget everything, to clear his mind, even a little. Quickly he reached into his pocket, pulled out his book and placed it on the small table in front of him. As he flipped through the pages, the words slowly began to unravel the chaos in his mind. Books had always been a form of escape for him. His eyes moved across the lines, struggling slightly against the turbulence of the plane. After a while, his eyes grew tired. Long-haul flights tended to be a bit more turbulent, and this unsettled Samuel. Closing the book, he decided to rest his eyes for a bit. He leaned his head back slightly and took a deep breath as he closed his eyes. Sleeping on a plane was never easy, but he had always forced himself to do it. Sometimes, sleeping for a long time helped him forget all the disappointments and the small but accumulating frustrations inside him. At that moment, he wanted to be somewhere else, somewhere he could simply feel happy and at peace. When he finally opened his eyes, the plane had settled a little. However, the tension from the earlier meal service still left a mark on his soul. Slowly, he sat up straight, shaking his head slightly, trying to regain his composure. Moving around on an airplane, like in many other places, always required a bit of courage for Samuel. On long flights, everyone eventually needed to use the restroom, and he was no exception. He had learned from past experiences that reaching his destination was never as simple as it should be. But still, he believed that no one should have the power to deny him something so basic. All he needed was a few minutes of solitude, a quiet space to breathe. This was a physical necessity, yet sadly, some people refuse to acknowledge even the most fundamental human needs. Slowly, he made his way toward the restroom. He glanced at a flight attendant nearby, observing her as she moved swiftly between passengers, tending to various tasks. Approaching her, Samuel attempted to communicate his need to use the restroom using sign language. But this time, the response was harsher than he expected. The woman stared at his gestures for a few seconds, then abruptly turned her head away. Stepping back slightly, she snapped, "What are you trying to do?" Samuel, taken aback, tried again, repeating his signs, but she showed no interest. "I need to use the restroom," he signed multiple times, using his fingers to indicate his direction. The woman rolled her eyes and stepped back once more. Then, without any regard for those around her, she raised her voice, exclaiming, "How do you not understand?" Her tone was mocking, dismissive. Other passengers began to take notice. Some turned their heads away, pretending not to see what was happening. No one stepped in. No one spoke up. Samuel stood there, frozen in shock. It wasn't just about the restroom anymore. It was the quiet indifference of everyone around him. The flight attendant walked away toward another passenger, while Samuel lowered his head slightly, still hoping to claim his right to use the restroom. But this was the breaking point. Her reaction wasn't just about misunderstanding his inability to speak. It reflected a much deeper social prejudice. In that moment, Samuel felt the depth of his alienation stronger than ever. To watch people reduce his entire existence to a single deficiency, to see them strip away his humanity with just a glance, made the pain unbearable. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant returned, but this time, her demeanor was even more hostile. "You're not allowed to use the restroom here," she snapped, staring directly into his eyes. Samuel felt something stir deep inside him. Rebellion. At that moment, he realized that everything had a breaking point. The flight attendant stormed off without another word. Every step Samuel took toward fulfilling such a basic need was met with unnecessary resistance, forcing him to walk more cautiously every time. The other passengers continued watching in silence. No one defended him. No one pointed out how unfair and degrading this treatment was. Their silence hurt more than words ever could. No matter how much Samuel wanted to speak out or defend himself, nothing seemed like it would change. At that moment, the only thing he could do was lift his head and carry on with his journey. Slowly, he turned toward the restroom, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Inside, his heart pounded rapidly. All he had wanted was to use the restroom, one of the most basic human rights. Samuel closed the restroom door behind him and took a deep breath. The few minutes he spent inside had given him a slight sense of relief. All the tension he had experienced had momentarily faded with just a brief moment of solitude. However, he still felt that something was missing on this flight. Dealing with injustice and prejudice had never been easy. He had experienced these situations so many times before that, in a way, He had grown accustomed to facing them. Outside, things seemed calmer, but as he slowly made his way back to his seat and sat down, the uncertainty of how much longer this journey would last lingered in his mind. This trip was testing him both physically and mentally. He closed his eyes slightly and leaned back in his seat. The plane maintained a steady pace throughout the flight, but his mind was filled with thousands of thoughts. No matter what, he had to endure this flight. Only a few hours remained, and he needed to be patient. After a while, silence filled the cabin. Most passengers had closed their eyes, sitting comfortably in their seats. The restlessness within him gradually diminished. All he could feel was the steady movement of the plane and the occasional turbulence. At that moment, it seemed as if everything was fine, as if everyone was at peace. But life never guaranteed anything. Suddenly, the plane started to shake. At first, it was just a slight tremor, but then the turbulence became more intense. Samuel immediately opened his eyes, trying to grasp what was happening. The plane was swaying from side to side, and within seconds, passengers were rushing to fasten their seatbelts. Fear and panic quickly spread among them. Screams erupted. Some passengers covered their heads with their hands, while others clung to each other. Chaos had erupted inside the plane. As the turbulence worsened, people became more frantic, overcome with fear. Samuel gripped his seat tightly, bracing himself against the shaking. Despite the wave of fear creeping into his chest, he had built resilience over the years, enduring all kinds of challenges. He took a deep breath and tried to remain calm, scanning his surroundings. But his heart was racing. The unsettling feeling that everything could turn upside down at any moment gripped him just like it did everyone else. The plane continued to tremble violently, as if struggling against an invisible force. A few moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was calm, yet firm. "Dear passengers," the pilot announced, "we have collided with a flock of birds, but there is no danger. At this time, there is nothing to worry about regarding our safety. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened." Despite the reassurance, some passengers were not comforted by the announcement. Many were still frightened by the ongoing turbulence, some clutching each other tightly, others crying quietly. The impact of the collision had thrown them into panic mode. Everyone on the flight was experiencing the shock of the incident, reacting with a primal instinct to survive. Samuel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. After the initial chaos, the cabin grew quieter, but he knew that the fear people felt wasn't just about physical safety. Fear was more than just a reaction. It revealed the fragile nature of human connection. In moments like these, people weren't thinking about understanding each other or standing together. They were simply trying to survive. The plane was still shaking, but as the pilot had said, Samuel felt they were safe. The aircraft was built to withstand situations like this. Yet, in the midst of all the fear and commotion, Samuel found himself reflecting on his silence, his inability to speak, and the indifference of those around him. Even in moments of crisis, people still chose not to engage, not to acknowledge one another. But that was something he had long since gotten used to. Gradually, the turbulence eased. The shaking subsided, and the pilot made another announcement, this time sounding more relaxed and reassuring. "Dear passengers, everything is under control. There is no longer any risk. You may now remove your seatbelts and relax." Slowly, the tension in the cabin began to dissipate. As things returned to normal, the passengers settled into silence. Samuel leaned back in his seat once more, closing his eyes again. The journey continued, but this incident had left a mark on everyone. The panic and fear would likely become the most unforgettable part of this flight. The plane had finally stabilized. The turbulence had ceased, and one by one, the passengers began to collect themselves. After a few announcements, everyone was slowly trying to return to normal. Yet, in that moment, It felt as though no one would ever forget the fear they had experienced. Everyone had suddenly realized how fragile life truly was. A collision with a flock of birds had been more than just a few seconds of fear. It had been an awakening. They had once again been reminded of how precious and fleeting everything was. Samuel took a deep breath as he gazed out the window. Life had always taught him hardship, but today he felt that something needed to change. Many passengers exchanged silent glances, sharing the fear and panic they had just endured. But more importantly, something else had started to shift. People had begun to notice the silent man among them. He had always been condemned to loneliness, but this time, there was a difference. This time, he was not alone. Men and women, young and old, all of them had started to question the way the flight attendant had treated Samuel. A few passengers struggled to find the courage to put their thoughts into words. One of them turned to another and asked, "Why did we say nothing?" Another felt the weight of that question even more deeply. And suddenly, eyes began meeting across the cabin. As the flight attendant hurried down the aisle, a small group of passengers stepped forward to confront him. This time, their expressions were not friendly. Their faces carried unease and regret. One passenger, gathering the courage to speak, said, "It was so wrong to treat him like that." Others nodded silently in agreement. The flight attendant froze, his face reflecting surprise and guilt. Slowly, he lowered his head. "You're right," he murmured. "How could I have done that?" At last, he approached Samuel. His hands trembled slightly. "I'm sorry," he said. "Truly, I am sorry. The way I treated you before was completely wrong. What I did was unacceptable." Samuel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had never been one to express his emotions easily. Maybe this wasn't the exact moment he had been waiting for, but he knew that change was necessary. He could feel it. Then, the flight attendant turned to the entire cabin and, in a louder voice, said, "I owe all of you an apology. Every one of you deserves to be treated with dignity. Samuel is just as valuable as any other passenger. From now on, I will do everything I can to stand up for the rights of every person and to show the respect each of you deserves." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, the passengers gathered their courage. Some nodded in support of Samuel, while others whispered a quiet, "I'm sorry." A few simply met his eyes, silently trying to make amends for past mistakes. As the plane steadily made its way to its destination, Samuel felt a small but undeniable sense of relief. That day, it had not just been a flight, it had been a transformation. Perhaps, for everyone,